thanks to Hayek, who became a prominent figure among economists in Great Britain. And in the 1930s, Hayek popularized the Austrian business cycle theory in the Anglo-Saxon world, but only for a short period, because in 1936, Keynes's general theory was published, and then practically all of Hayek's supporters just went to become Keynesians, and nobody stayed with the Austrian school practically. But the only thing that actually then saved it from extinction was actually the publication of this book, Human Action. So this book was published in 1949 and turned out to be Mises's greatest work. And to the surprise of the publishers, it also became a commercial success. But in academia, it wasn't well received, because by that time, already Keynesians dominated the economics profession. But nevertheless, we gotta say that the book influenced future Austrian economists, such as Murray Rothbard and Israel Kirzner, who continued the tradition of the Austrian school, and Human Action is still the essential book for any aspiring Austrian economist today. All right, that was my short introduction, and I'm gonna move to the more substantive part of my presentation. As you can see, this book is very extensive, so I only chose to present two areas of human action that, at least to me, they were most relevant. First is the philosophy of science and methodology in economics, and the second being the Austrian monetary theory. So let's start with economics and the philosophy of science. First, I want to answer this. Why should we care about philosophy? Well, because whoever thinks he's doing economics without taking a philosophical stance is essentially wrong. The choice is really between having a well-understood philosophical position or having an implicit philosophical position that is brought on unconsciously. And today's economists are philosophically, basically all of them, logical positivists. That means they use the structure and the pattern of Newtonian mechanics to study economics. While Austrian economics was based on an entirely different philosophical foundation. Austrians would say that in order to use mathematics and statistics, we have to model economic activity as a state of affairs and not as a market process. Then we have lost sight of the essential elements of how the market actually works. Because positivists work under the motto, science is measurement. Much of economic life comes in a form not so readily measurable. Therefore, focusing on measurement misses the non-measurable, but essential components of human life. For example, can we quantify the value of leisure? I don't think so, and it's silly to try to quantify it, because value is subjective, ordinal, and leisure means very different stuff for different people. And we can only rank our preferences. We can't count the value of leisure, and we can't saying that I like vanilla ice cream 2.5 times more than chocolate ice cream. It doesn't make any sense, but I can say vanilla ice cream is better than chocolate ice cream for example. So that's why philosophy behind how we approach economics is important. That's why Mises devoted the first 200 pages of Human Action to explain his philosophy of science, which is also called epistemology. And I can explain what epistemology is. And I used Woody Allen, actually, to explain that. Because he says epistemology deals with two questions. Is it possible to know anything? And if not, how do we know that? Currently, the method of economics is copied from physics and other natural sciences. Therefore, economic research is based on the following procedure. You form a hypothesis from deductive reasoning. Then you test this hypothesis using some kind of statistical test.
And then, based on the statistical test, you provisionally accept or reject the hypothesis, but you wait for further evidence, and that can contradict the previous findings. And this is basically copied from physics. And in human action, Mises argues that the subject matter, that is, people, is entirely different than in physics, which deals, for example, with planets, which are natural, unmotivated subjects, and they are ruled by external forces. So in physics, the empirical method, laboratory experiments, is appropriate. But on the other hand, Mises claims that economics is ill-suited for empirical tests. For example, the insight that ceteris paribus, that means everything else staying equal, an increase in demand must result in an increase in prices, is not derived from experience. Because nobody has ever been in a position to observe a change in just one of the market data, everything else staying equal. Okay, let's take another example. The example of the Obama stimulus in the US. So we have these projections of Romer and Bernstein, who formed the basis on which this 800 billion stimulus was passed in Congress. And their projections show that without stimulus, unemployment would reach 9%, but with stimulus, a peak of 8% would be reached. And what happened? The unemployment peaked at 10%. So the Keynesians said, okay, we were wrong. No, they didn't say that. What they actually said was, well, thank God we had the stimulus. The recession was apparently way worse than we realized. So the stimulus just wasn't big enough. The stimulus should have been 2.9 trillion instead of 800 billion. But still they say, okay, the stimulus did do some good as it directly employed 700,000 Americans on construction projects, research grants, and so on. But now can the Austrians say, like, they put out their own model of the economy and test their hypothesis and empirically test the 2009 stimulus, can they say how many jobs the stimulus destroyed? Well, based on theory, we can only say that the stimulus, ceteris paribus, was harmful for the economy, as it took scarce resources out of the private sector and into the government. If you produce an empirical study saying the stimulus destroyed, 300,000 jobs, it's equally silly as saying it's created 700,000 jobs. Because we're dealing with an alternate reality that nobody can see, and thus we can never know with point accuracy what would have happened. So Mises was very much against the empirical method being used in economics, and claimed that you cannot empirically test anything in economics. That's why Mises used the purely deductive logic reasoning, which he called praxeology. And this praxeology is very controversial. Not using inductive reasoning is a distinctive feature for the methodology of the Austrian school. It's also the reason Austrian economics is called a cult by the mainstream. If I give an example of inductive reasoning, so you all have an idea. So we say January has always been cold here in Siberia, so we get this from experience. And we say today is January the 14th, so we can argue that it's going to be another cold day in Siberia. And we see this from experience. And an example of the deductive reasoning would be, all men are mortal. Chuck Norris is a man, so Chuck Norris is mortal. And this is from pure logic. If the first sentence is true, then if it's coherent, then the other sentences must be true as well. So Mises saw economics as this kind of deductive system. And Mises' logic of economics rests on the fundamental axiom that individual human beings act. More precisely, that people act purposefully towards goals. And all economic theorems are derived from this axiom of purposeful human action. And if you try to deny this axiom, you're engaging in a human act, so it's kind of undeniable. And therefore, for Mises, economics was the structure of logical implications of the fact that individuals act. And human action, Mises deduced the entire system of economics by using only these axioms. The fundamental axiom that we mentioned, that humans act with a purpose, plus two subsidiary axioms. One is that individuals vary, so individuals are different. And another one, that humans regard leisure as a valuable good. And Mises says these statements and propositions aren't derived from experience. They are like those of logic and math. They are a priori. And a priori statements are perfectly certain and not subject to verification or falsification on the ground of experience and facts. Of course, like in a priori math theorems, deductive reasoning has to be correct to be true. That is to say, Austrians are not infallible. So as I said before, Mises saw economics as a branch of logic, similar to geometry or mathematics. Which is kind of funny, because Mises criticizes the use of mathematics in economics. However, he sees economics as being similar to math in the sense that it's a deductive system. And Mises places economics in the same category as logic and mathematics. And he sees that the knowledge of economics is just like in math. It comes from within. It comes from our cognitive abilities and not from the outside world. But still, isn't it true that Austrians do empirical work by studying historical episodes like the Great Depression? That's true, but Mises separates between economics as a science and economic history, which is not a subset of economics, but a separate branch. And he says that the historian can't simply let the facts speak for themselves. He has to interpret the facts. And to do that, he must use his prior value judgments and theories to determine what is relevant and then present the facts based on that. And a good historian must rely on the knowledge of other disciplines like economics, physics, mathematics to interpret a historical event. Therefore, for example, when Murray Rothbard was writing America's Great Depression, he was doing so as a historian and not as an economist. Though it's true that he did apply his knowledge of economic theory to analyze the period in history we call the Great Depression. So let's take another example. A country raises the minimum wage and the unemployment rate goes down instead of up. So, does this disprove the logic of the minimum wage? Mises would say no, because unless you show a flaw in the logic, it just means that in this specific case, there were apparently other counteracting forces that were stronger than the increase in the minimum wage. Therefore, the unemployment rate went down. All right, now I'm going to turn into the subject of mathematics in economics. Currently, the economics profession follows the methodology of Paul Samuelson, who is perhaps the best known Keynesian economist, well, in the second part of the 20th century. Now, Samuelson argued that for economics to be rewritten in the language of mathematics. And the point of doing this was to force economists to make their previously implicit assumptions explicit. Therefore, he said verbal logic should be replaced by mathematical logic. But the problem is mathematical logic is only appropriate for physics
and other natural sciences. And physics, the science that has become the modern science, which modern positivists and empiricists believe all other social and physical sciences should emulate. In physics, the axioms and therefore the deductions are in themselves meaningless and only acquire meaning as they can, insofar as they explain and predict given facts. So they see change as
an outcome of mechanistic causality, and that's true in physics. For example, how gravity influences the motion of planets. It's purely governed by some kind of external force. But in economics, change is the outcome of human action and not of some kind of external forces. So, for example, if you go out and buy gold, you're not doing so because some external force is leading you, but it's just a part of human behavior. And in social sciences, the axioms themselves are known to be true and meaningful. And as a result, each verbal step-by-step deduction is also true and meaningful. For it is the great quality of verbal propositions that each one is meaningful, whereas mathematical symbols are not meaningful in themselves. And by the way, this is also what John Maynard Keynes argued himself in the general theory, that his followers, Keynesians, don't agree with this. They tend to ignore this fact. But you could ask, for example, isn't math more precise than verbal language, and therefore we should put our verbal thoughts into mathematical form to bring clarity, because verbal language is perhaps too vague. All right, so if you could all have a look at your handouts. Does everybody have them?